Great. I think we should probably get started then so we don't run over too much. But thank you everyone for joining us today for our CAP webinar on targeting. So I'm joined by my colleague Justin, who works in our copy advice team. And I'm sure some of you may recognize me from previous trainings, but my name's Ramneet. I work on the comms team at the ASA and I look after all of our training and events. So the focus of today's session is going to be looking at the targeting rules that we have in place and looking specifically at examples of influencer marketing as well. So I'm not going to keep you for too long. I'm going to hand over to Justin now, who is going to give you a bit of an intro into what we'll be covering today and then taking you through the rules. So I'll hand over to you, Justin.
Great, thanks Ramneet. Good morning everyone. So yeah, as Ramneet said, I'm Justin Davis. I work on the copy advice team. So if you call the number or submit a query, you've got a 1 in 6 chance of speaking to me. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you about the ASA's targeting rules, which are outlined in the CAP code. There's going to be an emphasis on influencer marketing. But some of the examples I give you, it will be online advertising rather than influencer marketing, but that's just to kind of illustrate the principles that I'm going to talk you through. So on we go. I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So we'll give that about 15 minutes. And if you could sort of try and stick to kind of general principles based questions. If you've got any kind of more specific things about a campaign that you're planning or that you're running, maybe you could send that to me in a follow-up email or put it through to copy advice just to save everyone's time. Okay, so what will we be covering today? We will be looking at which product types are age restricted. So what that means is if you're advertising a product of this nature, what restrictions are attached to them? When we talk about restrictions in this context, we're talking specifically about targeting restrictions. So what measures do you need to take to ensure that ads for these products aren't delivered to children or under 18s? And just to illustrate that, we're going to look at various ASA rulings. So if you're not familiar, you've got the CAP code, which is kind of like the equivalent to the law. And then you've got ASA rulings, which is more like the equivalent of case law. So that they give you a kind of insight into how the rules apply in practice. So we'll kind of cover both of those sides of things today. Okay, so as you can see, the CAP code, it's the non-broadcast advertising code. If we're talking about radio or TV, which we're not today, that'll be the BCAP code. And as you can see on the right, there are many, many different sections of the code. Some of them will be very general issues like privacy or, use of data for marketing, section 10. Some of it is very sector specific. And the rules that I'm going to talk you through today, the targeting rules, they don't have a dedicated section. So those rules are kind of dotted around in all these different sections of the code. So that's why I think this training should be particularly useful, because hopefully after today, you'll know exactly where to look. Okay, so first of all, the most important thing really is which product types have targeting restrictions. And I think this is the very first point. If you're planning a campaign or a brand has asked you to run a campaign, this is the first point to kind of check really is what product am I advertising and are there any targeting restrictions attached to them? Okay, so the following product types all have major targeting restrictions relating to children or to under 18. So I'll explain that distinction in a minute. So alcohol, e-cigarettes, gambling, and lotteries, they're the big ones. So if anyone asks you to run an alcohol campaign, red flag immediately. What implications does this have for targeting? And this is particularly important for social media and young people. Okay. So some products are permitted for over 16s, and these include ads for lotteries and ads for HFSS, food or soft drinks. So HFSS, if you're not familiar, it stands for high in food, high in fat, salt or sugar. products that are permitted to be advertised only to over 18s are alcohol, gambling, and electronic cigarettes. I couldn't tell you exactly what the background is to that distinction between lottery and gambling advertising, but it does exist. Okay, so there are some products that don't have that type of stringent age restriction that you get applied to e-cigarettes, alcohol, or gambling. And I've listed them in the column on the left here. So there is a restriction that applies to ads for slimming and weight control products. And that restriction is that they can't be directed at under 18s. And then ads for medicines and HFSS products can't be directed at under 16s. So I've put HFSS in red here because you might be aware the government's just announced plans to introduce a total ban on online ads for HFSS products. So that won't come until, I think, April 2022, after which all of this stuff that I'm about to cover will kind of be academic. But in the meantime, we've got a good few months of advertising online before that ban comes in. So it's the rules that I cover today will continue to apply. The stuff on the columns on the right, sorry, I'll just go back. These aren't specifically age restricted in the same way as alcohol or gambling, but the ASA would still expect you to apply some sort of consideration around targeting. So if, for example, you're advertising like sex toys or anything that's kind of particularly adult in nature, there's nothing in the code that specifically refers to those products, but it's really just about kind of using your common sense and not directing them at children in an online space in the same way that you kind of wouldn't put an ad for that on a billboard opposite a school. And similarly, it's not just about the product type, it's also just about the kind of the content of the ad. So, if there's anything that's particularly adult in theme, potentially offensive language, swear words, anything sexually suggestive, similarly, the ASA would expect you to just apply some common sense and apply some of these targeting considerations. So what are those targeting restrictions that apply to these ads? They kind of fall into two categories. So the first is what I'll refer to as the directed at type of restriction. And the second is the 25% rule. So where ads for the products that I've just covered, where those ads can be individually targeted at people through, platform-based targeting tools, there is an expectation that they should just, kind of blanket prohibition on them being directed at consumers who are under 18 or under 16. So if you've got the ability to determine exactly which users on a given platform or in a given app, if you can determine exactly which ones receive particular posts, the expectation would be, you restrict it absolutely. Where you don't have those user by user targeting tools in place, or where it's what I think the ASA is referred to as one-to-many marketing, that's when something called the 25% rule would apply. And basically that just means that you should hold data to demonstrate that no more than 25% of the audience are under 18 or under 16, depending on the product. So as I've indicated, these rules, they don't just relate to, what you should do in practice, they also relate to the type of evidence that you should hold in the instance of someone making a complaint about your ad. So even if you have done sort of everything in your power to target something responsibly, in the unfortunate circumstance of a child seeing the ad and someone complaining to the ASA would then ask you, what evidence can you present to us to show that you targeted your ad responsibly? And so you need to kind of have that to hand in that instance. Okay, so in all of the code rules that have been dotted around the different sections, they all follow the same sort of basic wording. So for alcohol, gambling, and e-cigarettes, the wording is, ads must not be directed at people under 18 through the selection of media or the context in which they appear. And likewise, the same sort of pattern of wording applies to lottery and HFSS food ads. Okay, so the Committee of Advertising Practice, which is the department that I'm in, and which also involves the regulatory policy team, they've produced a really useful document, which you can see on the right, called Age-Restricted Ads Online. And this gives some pretty up-to-date, detailed explanation of the ASA and CAP's position on this stuff. So to find it, if you just go to the ASA website, there's a search box in the top right hand of the homepage. And if you just type in the words age restricted, it should be the top result. But I'd really recommend, if you want to kind of go into all this stuff in more detail, I'd recommend just finding this document. But it gives the example that I've quoted here on you know, how the ASA and CAP will interpret, you know, the directed at test. So age-restricted marketing communications must not be placed in or around media or content that's obviously directed at a protected age category. In most cases, it's easy to identify whether it's directed at children or under 18s, and they give some examples here. So a channel with content obviously and primarily for children. So for example, something about fairy tales, youth soccer skills, an influencer social media account where, you know, the editorial focus is very much on things that appeal particularly to children, or a website offering content explicitly to children. So, you know, in all of these cases, because the overall focus of that media type is specifically oriented towards children, it would be, you know, if an alcohol ad or a gambling ad appeared in that context, it would be a fairly straightforward decision for the ASA to say this was not appropriately targeted. Okay, so let's just give you an example of an ad that breached this rule. So this was a ruling from 2018. The ASA received a complaint that a child had seen this ad for Captain Morgan on Snapchat. So it was a lens that was available to people. The advertisers had used Captain Morgan's targeting tools to deliver it to people who'd registered as 18 plus. But when the ASA kind of assessed whether that was sufficient, they noted that Snapchat at the time did not have any kind of interest-based targeting system. So their only targeting abilities that were available on the app were people's self-declared age. Given the prevalence of teenagers, you know, being untruthful about their age when using social media platforms like Snapchat, the ASA considered there was nothing that was really preventing under 18s from just declaring their age as 18 plus. So as a result, the advertisers didn't really have any kind of robust way of ensuring that this ad for an alcohol product wasn't directly delivered to under 18s. I understand, yeah, that Snapchat have since introduced a kind of more robust targeting restrictions. So an important difference to note from the outset between straightforward brand advertising like this and influencer marketing is that generally influencers won't have access to any targeting tools. So if you're, you know, say I'm a regular Instagram user and I happen to have a large following, which is a big hypothetical, and say an alcohol brand approaches me and says, you know, we'd like you to promote our product, because I don't have a business account on the app, I wouldn't have access to any of those targeting tools. So in that case, the directed at rule wouldn't really apply necessarily, because you know, I wouldn't be able to specify either on interest or age. It would very much come down to my audience profile. So that's where the 25% rule comes in. So this applies where advertisers don't have the ability to target ads on an individual person by person basis. This 25% rule it's only explicitly stated in the code rules for HFSS foods, alcohol and e-cigarettes. But if you refer to that guidance, that CAP guidance on age restricted ads online, it does make the point that this 25% principle cross applies to any other age restricted products. That includes gambling and lottery products. So yeah, no medium should be used to advertise age restricted products if more than 25% of the audience is under the required age. So now that we know what the age restricted products are and what the basic targeting restrictions mean, let's look at how they apply on different social media platforms. Okay, so first of all, we've got Instagram. As I've mentioned, when it's a paid post from a company account, you'll have access to Facebook's full suite of targeting tools, which are fairly reliable. That would then give you access to, say on a person by person basis, who is seeing this. And so the 25% rule wouldn't apply, it would more be the directed at one. And let's give you an example of this is an influencer ad on Instagram. So this is an ad that the ASA received a complaint about and ruled on back in 2020 from an influencer called Luke Mabbott. There are a couple of different points that people complained about, but let's just focus on the alcohol restriction. So that was Code Rule 18.15, which says marketing communications must not be directed at people under 18 through the selection of media or the context in which they appear. So a few people thought that Luke Mabbott was, appealing to under 18s, that he had a kind of teenage following. And the following, that 25% rule, that was the key here because, Luke didn't have access to specific targeting tools. So in this case, the brand itself, Global Brands, they had done their due diligence. They'd gathered the audience data about this particular influencer, and they were able to provide that to the ASA to demonstrate that it was significantly less than 25% of the audience were under the age of 18. So even though this, this wasn't a kind of sort of specifically age-gated ad or anything, it would have been seen by this particular influencer's followers, and because there was audience data about that audience, and it met the 25% rule, so the complaint was not upheld. Okay, so here's another example of an Instagram ad. In this case, the complaint was that it was advertising HFSS products to under 16s. I think the product was, what was it? It was Nutella, yeah. So in this case, again, the complaint was not upheld. That was because the ASA found that the advertiser had used the most robust available demographic data, which in this case was the subscribers of the YouTube channel that these two influencers were particularly well known for, as well as demographic data about their worldwide followers on Instagram specifically. And so the ASA therefore ruled that the ads were not targeted at under 16s, and that they were targeted at an audience where more than 75% of that audience were over 16. Okay, so let's look at YouTube now. So one point to make is the ASA will always factor in how different platforms are used in practice to the best of our knowledge. And the ASA generally is aware that YouTube is often watched on shared devices. Since YouTube is a Google product, if you're logged into one Google account on the same computer, you'll often automatically be logged into YouTube too. So what that means in practice is if a child watches YouTube on a particular computer, the chances are they'll be logged in, under someone else's name. So it could be a parent. So for that reason, the age profile of the person who's logged in isn't really considered relevant. It's not considered a kind of appropriately robust way of targeting content on YouTube. So for that reason, the appropriateness of an ad that's targeted on YouTube will generally, in the ASA's view, generally depend on the nature of the video content itself, and whether it's pitched at or particularly likely to appeal to children or young people. So the 25% test probably would be applied in this case rather than the directed at requirement. So let's look at an example. Okay, so this isn't an influencer ad, but this ruling gives you an idea of the ASA's approach to this stuff. So in this case, it was a pre-roll ad that appeared before a George Ezra music video. We received complaints about this. The ASA themselves decided to challenge whether the ad for this HFSS product was targeted at children through the choice of media placement, the context in which the ad was selected to appear. And this is a particularly useful ruling because it really goes through the ASA's rationale and their requirements around targeting. So if the advertisers only relied on the self-reported age of the user, this wouldn't be good enough, and that's spelled out in the ruling. Therefore, the ASA took the view the advertisers should rely on interest-based targeting and should also factor in the overall proportion of under 16s that use YouTube. So just the overall general audience profile of YouTube users, irrespective of this particular video. And in this case, the ASA ruled that the ad did not breach the targeting rules. The advertiser had used a good mix of targeting techniques. So it ranged from the stated age of the user, which, as we've covered, that's not good enough in isolation, but also interest-based factors, data from a third-party platform provider, and data indicating that around 96% of George Ezra's audience on YouTube was over 18. And the ASA also noted data that YouTube was a platform that was principally used by over 18s. So that might be a bit different if we were talking about kind of TikTok, for example, which skews towards a younger user demographic. So although in this case, a child had seen the ad when using a shared device and they'd seen it without being logged in this case, because of all that data that and evidence that the advertisers were able to show to the ASA ruled that they'd taken every reasonable step to avoid that happening, and kind of took the view that in some cases, a few people slipped through the cracks. So it's not overly punitive. It's not that, you know, if kind of lightning strikes and a child sees the ad, that's an automatic upheld ruling. But you really just need that evidence that you kind of took all reasonable precautions. So similarly to YouTube, which shouldn't be a surprise, Google searches, in terms of, you know, and this will be less relevant to influencer advertising, but just the approach on Google searches is that you should really be mindful of interest-based standards rather than who's logged in. So in this particular case, there was a gambling company. They had an online casino game called Jack and the Beanstalk. And anyone who entered Jack and the Beanstalk into Google to search for it would automatically be displayed this gambling ad. And just, you know, the relatively straightforward rationale here. Any child who searched for a popular children's story would automatically be delivered you know, an ad for a gambling product, which is age restricted. So the ASA ruled that they breached the rules through this choice of context. In this place, the context being search results for a popular children's story. Okay, so onto Twitter. So, you know, again, as with the other platforms that we've covered, there's a difference between promoted tweets where, you know, it's in a paid for space. You have access to specific tools about which individual users see the post versus organic tweets, which, you know, generally influencers will tend to post. So promoted tweets, generally the targeting evidence that you'd need there would not be the 25% rule. It would be that you'd, you know, taken measures to exclude on the basis of, you know, Twitter's assessment of age and interest profile. But if we're talking about influencer posts where you don't have those targeting tools, it will generally be about the subject matter and the audience demographics that you need to demonstrate wasn't appealing to kids. So sorry for picking on Captain Morgan again, but this is another useful ruling that really spells out the ASA's rationale. So in this ruling, the ASA considered that the proportion of under 18s on Twitter would be relevant in determining the extent to which, you know, it was appropriately targeted. So for instance, on platforms popular with under 18s, it could be necessary for marketers to select both interest-based factors and deselect interest-based factors. On the other hand, if an ad appeared on a medium that was used by hardly any under 18s, then interest-based targeting might in those circumstances be unnecessary. That's what it says in the ruling. So in this case, complaints about the ad being inappropriately targeted were not upheld. When the ASA made its decision, it noted that available data from Twitter and from other sources showed that between 81% and 91% of overall Twitter users were over the age of 18. And in addition, so this was in a paid for space, the advertisers had used keywords to direct ads, this ad specifically to university students, and had used a follower targeting function so that the ad would be delivered just to people who followed the Unilad account. So again, they used all these, all the tools available to restrict under 18s from seeing the post. Okay, so we've already seen the Instagram post from this ASA ruling, but the ruling also referred to a Twitter post from the Nutella campaign. So that Twitter analytics couldn't provide a breakdown of follower demographics, but the targeting was considered appropriate, bearing in mind the demographic data about their followers on other platforms, as well as the demographic data about Twitter's overall users. So in this case, you know, because it was an Instagram, an influencer post, Alfie Days did not have access to all of the targeting tools that we saw from the Captain Morgan example. So in that case, the 25% rule applied, and the ASA ruled that it was appropriately targeted, bearing in mind the overall profile of Twitter users being over 18 and a kind of extrapolation of the audience data from a different platform. Okay, so another point to be mindful of is promotional marketing on social media, and a few advertisers have tripped up on this point. And it's basically, if you're running a promotion and you're asking, if particularly influencer marketing we're talking about, if you're asking people to participate in the promotion by liking, sharing, or retweeting that initial post, you could have been incredibly careful in the first instance by saying, you know, doing an assessment of the audience profile of this particular influencer, saying all of my followers, you know, are significantly over 18. You could do all of your due diligence then, but if you're then asking their followers to like, share, or retweet this particular post, suddenly you're losing control of the targeting, because it then becomes, you know, who are the followers of the people who are sharing the or retweeting or liking you know, the initial post. It could be that, you know, someone who follows the influencer for whatever reason, it could be that all of their friends are teenagers under 18s, and if they're then retweeting something at the advertiser's suggestion, suddenly, you know, against the advertiser's best wishes, suddenly the ad for example, an alcohol product is being mass disseminated to teenagers. So if you've got an age-restricted product and you're using a platform where, you know, liking, sharing, retweeting kind of makes the initial post be prominently displayed to people's followers, I would advise against using that type of promotional tool, just because if the ASA asks you what measures did you take to ensure it wasn't seen by under 18s, you're just not going to be able to provide evidence for that. So here's an example that went wrong. So I think the advertisers in this case, this initial post was fine because, you know, I think they had evidence that everyone who, you know, was friends with the garage or visited their page was generally over 18. But because users were then invited to like and share, the advertisers completely lost control of who was seeing the ad, and the campaign breached the code for that reason. Okay, so just to recap, as we've already covered, ads for these product types have targeting restrictions attached to them. But as I've already mentioned, an ad could also be considered unsuitable for children, even if it's not for a restricted product. So sorry, just to go back. This unsuitable standard that I mentioned, it's reflected in, sorry, Romney, I've shot ahead. Yeah, sorry about that. So the standard about unsuitable content, generally, if there's a complaint about this, it will be looked at under Code Rule 5.1. Marketing communications addressed to, targeted directly at, or featuring children must contain nothing that's likely to result in their physical, mental, or moral harm. So moral harm might seem like, a slightly Victorian concept, but it's just designed to capture any kind of adult material, like overt references to sex or violence, or the type of adult-oriented products that I mentioned earlier. And one ad that breached this rule on that front was this was an email campaign for Boohoo, the clothing brand. So there's no age restriction attached to clothing advertising, but in this case, the complaint was that the subject line of this email was "send nudes," which the complainant thought was socially irresponsible. Boohoo acknowledged that the brand is targeted at 16 to 24-year-olds, but they said that the ad had only been sent to subscribers who reported their age as 18 plus. As we've covered, the ASA takes the view online age is often misreported. That's backed up by quite a lot of evidence. And Boohoo hadn't taken any additional steps to ensure it wasn't sent to under 18s. And the ASA's rationale for why this was socially irresponsible to send to at least some under 18s was that the phrase "send nudes" was likely to be understood as referring to requests for sexual photos, which could be a form of sexual harassment, and increased pressures to share such photos had been linked to negative outcomes for young people. So just from that general social responsibility perspective, this was considered inappropriate targeting. Okay. And a final consideration before we round things up is the post third-party cookie era. So as some of you might be aware, more and more web browsers and kind of major online publishers such as Google are moving away from allowing access to third-party cookies to advertisers. That will obviously mean that while users have a bit more kind of sense of privacy, advertisers are going to have less access to demographic data about who they're advertising to. It's still very early days with this, but there are a few potential impacts to consider. Basically, if an audience is demographically anonymous, if you've got no information about the age profiles of the people seeing it, it might be necessary just to reconsider advertising an age-restricted product on that platform. It's just going back to the point of, if you've got no access to demographic data because of, for example, lack of third-party cookies, when the ASA comes to you and says, what evidence do you have that under 18s wouldn't see this, you just wouldn't be able to provide that evidence. So important questions to ask at the advertising end. And context and interest-based targeting may then be more relevant. So if you don't know the age profile of the individual users, applying more of the kind of standards that we've seen applied to, for example, YouTube, where you look at, okay, the ad is appearing next to something about George Ezra. Who's George Ezra's audience profile? Is this something that's going to appeal particularly to children? If not, then you're on safer ground. So that might be the type of rationale and evidence that you rely on a little bit more as we move away from, third-party cookies. Okay, so just to round up now, the key points are: make sure you're aware of any age restrictions that apply to the products you're advertising. If targeting tools are available, use them as much as possible to ensure the ad is delivered appropriately. And if these tools aren't available, make sure you hold the most robust evidence that is available about the audience. Okay, now finally, where can you get help? So you can follow us on Twitter. We've got an ASA and a CAP Twitter account. You can sign up to our newsletters. These insight articles, they'll vary depending on particular topics. So we might send out an insight just giving people an overview of the food rules, or like we've just seen a question in the chat about CBD, or they'll be very subject specific, and they contain links to more detailed guidance. We run more training seminars and bespoke presentations like this one. We've also got a host of very good e-learning modules that you can sign up to. You can contact the copy advice team where I work, so you can call us on between 9 and 5 every weekday if you've got a general question, or you can send in a written advice request and we'll get back to you within 24 hours. We've got a whole database of advice online articles, for example, covering targeting, or any of the stuff that I've talked about today. And in the rulings page of our website, we cover weekly ASA rulings, which are published every Wednesday. So now, sorry, I've run over a little bit over the 30 minutes, but open to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. I think we've had a couple of questions come in, so let's run through these. So someone's asked, how objective versus subjective are the ASA with ads? It sounds like a lot is based on opinion, although there are statistics taken into consideration as well. So objectiveness versus subjectiveness.
I'm guessing that refers to interest-based assessments. I think, as you'll see if you look through some of those rulings, it's pretty objective. The ASA wouldn't take it for granted. For example, with that example of the George Ezra video, the ASA actually challenged that because they didn't want to take for granted who is and isn't listening to this sort of video. There are some cases where it is a little subjective, like I think a few years ago, Madonna was kind of dissed when the ASA ruled that her music didn't appeal to young people, and therefore it was appropriate to to advertise age-restricted products kind of around some content about her. But it's generally, the onus is on advertisers to submit, age data, rather than just to say, well, of course, no children are listening to this. So I think in this particular area, it's one of the less subjective aspects of the ASA's regulation.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And another question, how are marketers supposed to tackle something like misreported age? Should this be the responsibility of the application or web service provider?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, from the ASA's perspective, it's not really relevant, because I think at the moment the ASA is just taking it for granted that age is misreported. In order to kind of address that, I guess it is up to sort of lobbying the platforms to have a kind of more robust form of age verification. Until that's in place, the ASA will probably still just take the view that you can't trust it. But yeah, I guess it is the responsibility. Well, maybe the platforms will just take the view it's not worth the bother. But I can see that it's in advertisers' interest to have more access to kind of reliable age data. I think anecdotally, a couple of people that I know have seen requests, I think on YouTube, asking them to verify their age with a passport picture. I'm not sure what the background to that is, but I guess if it's going to become more reliable, it would be up to the platforms introducing that more stringent verification in order to kind of convince them to introduce that. Yeah, I guess, you need to do some convincing. But yeah, in the meantime, the ASA just would take it for granted that you kind of can't trust that self-reported stuff.
Mm-hmm. Someone else has asked, how can we make sure that a post is not reposted on an account with an under 18 audience?
I suppose you can't, but in the example that I was giving about promotions, the point was that the influencer post, or the example that I gave, they were actively soliciting regular users of the platform to retweet it or share it, and they were kind of incentivizing them doing so. I think it will kind of vary. So across platforms, I mean, in terms of, if you like a particular post on some platforms, I understand that will make it automatically be sort of displayed to your followers, whereas on others, maybe that wouldn't be the case. But I think it's the concern is less that something could be retweeted. It's more about cases where the advertiser is actively asking people to retweet or share it. And so, it's kind of, their campaign is based on it being shared with a wider audience that they don't have any age data about.
Perfect. Thanks, Justin. Yeah, and we've had another question in the chat about CBD products. And obviously, I know we probably haven't got time to give an overview on what the restrictions are around that, but I think there is lots of guidance on the website about this.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So if the individual who asked that question wants to pop us an email at events@asa.org.uk, so I've got your email address, and then I can forward you across the information on that. And as Justin mentioned, if there's any specifics, you can definitely get in touch with the copy advice team as well.
Just a final point about CBD products. It will slightly depend on the nature of the product. So, for example, if you've got a CBD e-cigarette, that'll be under the banner of e-cigarette restrictions. Probably it would be considered just a kind of inappropriate product to advertise to under 18s, but we can give you a more substantial answer to that, as Ramneet says, if you put in a request to copy advice.
Perfect, great. If anyone has any further questions, do feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. But as I mentioned, I will send around a follow-up email with a recording of the session, a copy of the slides, and more information on how you can get in touch with copy advice as well. It doesn't look like we've got any further questions. So thanks so much, Justin. I hope everyone found the session important.
Yeah, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.